Hello there, Paddington Academy historians. It is a pleasure to be back with you for revision video 22. Well, 22 for you guys. It's actually the third one I'm recording. I'm doing them completely out of sequence, and it's actually the first one with my new microphone. So if you notice a major improvement in the audio quality from Unit 1 and Unit 10, which were the first two that I made, this is why I decided to buy a microphone for you guys to make slightly better videos. So yeah, now we're going to get moving on Unit 22 today. It is, of course, a bit of a belter. It falls within those final 4 units of the Cold War course, looking at the end of the Cold War. And really, we're going to be evaluating how important summit diplomacy was as a cause of the end of the Cold War. Okay. So the first place we really need to start is the relationship between these two gentlemen, okay? And of course that is Ronald Reagan, American president from 1981 through to 1989. If I can annotate my screen, let's go. Come on, Mr. Trojan. Here we go. 1981, after he defeats Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election until 1989. And of course Mikhail Gorbachev, who becomes Soviet leader in 1985. All the way up until 1991, okay? And just a reminder, towards the end of today's video, we will be looking at George Bush Sr., who replaces Reagan in 1989 as president, and obviously oversees those final few years of the Cold War. So let's go into these two individuals. And I think the most important thing for us to be aware of was that Mikhail Gorbachev was unlike previous Soviet leaders, okay? He was actually not born at the time of the 1917 Russian Revolution. He's not an old communist. He's not Bolshevik, and he's not communist old guard, okay? He is a reformer. And with his reformist mindset, he believes that the security of the USSR would be achieved through political and economic means, not military. And he signals that pretty instantaneously with the removal of the Brezhnev Doctrine, of course, in this early period. De facto, it was pretty clear that he'd removed it by 1986-87, but it's really clear later on in the period, as you could say, de jure, in terms of him removing the Brezhnev Doctrine. And I think the other thing for us to be aware of is that Gorbachev, becoming premier in 1985, was emerging as leader of the Soviet Union after several years of what we call the gerontocracy. Now, reminder, if you're geriatric, you're old, your health's declining. Think about Brezhnev. Brezhnev was very old by his last few years in office. He dies, I think, late 70s, and he was very, very ill by the time of the late 70s and early 80s. He's then replaced by Yuri Andropov, who is similarly in his 70s, old guard, and his health is failing. He only lasts for a year and 91 days. And then he is replaced by Chernenko, who's actually older than Andropov, and he only lasts a year and 29 days. So Gorbachev's kind of a new generation of leaders. And just to show you this, every single Soviet leader was actually born before the Russian Revolution. Okay, so Lenin, 1870, Stalin, 1878, Khrushchev, 1894, Brezhnev, 1906, Andropov, 1914, Chermenko, 1911. So they remember those early years of the Russian Revolution. Gorbachev was born in 1931. He is just not of that generation, okay? So, in Gorbachev's view, there needed to be an end to confrontation and competition between the superpowers, which of course paves the way for summit diplomacy. And Gorbachev moved away from these kind of traditional Marxist ideas of inevitable conflict between capitalism and communism, and began to move towards basically what we can call new thinking, which was a much more pragmatic, conciliatory and diplomatic relationship with the West. And really, you know, we have to think about Reagan too. At the same time, Ronald Reagan, despite his hardline communist rhetoric or anti-communist rhetoric in those early years when he calls the USSR an evil empire and he says he'll leave communism on the ash heap of history, he also fears the consequences of nuclear war. Reagan himself is pragmatic, and the second that Gorbachev comes to power and Reagan recognizes that this is a man he can do business with, he ultimately makes channels and opens diplomatic channels to be able to reopen summit diplomacy and begin negotiations with the East. So by the mid-1980s, both leaders were willing to talk, not because they necessarily trusted each other, but because confrontation had simply become too dangerous, and Reagan recognized that this was an opportunity to genuinely end the Cold War. So Let's very quickly just look at the kind of overview here. So a reminder, we've got 4 key summits in our early period, and then we've of course got the Malta Summit in 89. So we've got Geneva in 85, Reykjavik 86, Washington 87, and then Moscow in 1988, and then our final summit in 1989. But just a reminder that this one is headed by Bush, of course. And then we've got the START talks that are finally signed in 1991, but that comes into Unit 24, just be aware. But you could, if you want to, feed it into this unit in parts. So without further ado, let's get started on, oh no, I forgot I had a slide first. So we've just looked at unit 21. Okay, so unit 21 is all about new thinking and Mikhail Gorbachev's problems. But just a reminder of the state of the Soviet economy during this period in time. Okay, we've got all of these inherited economic problems, which then of course leads to new thinking. And just a reminder, new thinking is actually being developed alongside these summits. New thinking is almost hinted at, but it's not really introduced until 1986, 87. Okay. So actually, when we're thinking about what happens at Geneva, that's really before new thinking has been properly established. But I think that this economic context is really important for us to be factoring in when we're thinking about the success of these summits, shall we say. So let's have a look at Geneva. So the first summit took place in Geneva in 1985, and the main kind of key summary here is that there were no formal agreements made between the different sides, okay? But there was discussion on reducing nuclear weapons by 50%, as well as banning chemical weapons. But there was nothing formal in writing. These are just gentle discussions and areas of broad agreement, okay? Yeah, and the discussion on the ban of chemical weapons and nuclear weapons spreading elsewhere in the globe, and alongside this, Gorbachev begins to develop his new thinking. No concrete agreements were made, as we said, but both sides were determined to present it as a success to the media. And the main obstacle, of course, was SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Reagan's Star Wars project. And we will look at this later on in this session, okay? So if we're thinking about the impact of this, well, it does signal a clear shift in the ideological split between East and West, with both sides making overtures towards reconciliation and diplomacy. But there are no concrete agreements made. However, if we want to go back to that classic Mr. Sayer language, it does pave the way for Reykjavik and later developments. So Reykjavik is our next summit in October 1986, and there was a lot of hype at Reykjavik that maybe a deal could be done towards some sort of nuclear forces treaty that would eventually be signed in 1987 in terms of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty. But ultimately, Reykjavik does end up being a bit of a disaster, for several reasons. Okay, again, there were no concrete agreements made. The talks do go further at Reykjavik, but they then collapse, and they end up collapsing because basically Reagan gets particularly angry because he's not getting any major concessions from Gorbachev. Gorbachev is saying he's willing to reduce arms, but only if Reagan would abandon the Strategic Defense Initiative, which of course Reagan refuses to do. Now, this is a bit of a low point, okay, because on the surface, the summit looks like a complete failure. There's no agreements, there's no joint statement, and there is visible frustration on both sides. However, behind the scenes, aides were drafting proposals that would later become formal agreements, okay? So what you need to imagine and remember, and I always say this in the lesson, at these big conferences, at these big summits, there are always politicians behind the scene, okay? Aides, diplomats, advisors, special advisors, running around these hotels, running around these grand halls, and they are bumping into other aides, and they are having discussions, and they are beginning to ultimately lay out the framework for a later big agreement. So yeah, Reykjavik's kind of important, not for what it achieved, but for showing how close sides were to genuine disarmament because of what happens behind the scenes, really. And I think that's the key point, is that even though nothing's signed yet, the first two summits were important in paving the way for 1987 and our key moment, okay? Because this summit produced the most significant breakthrough. The INF Treaty is signed. A reminder, INF stands for, can I write it on here? Probably not. Intermediate, oh my God, this is awful. Nuclear Forces Treaty. Oh my God, that is a bad one, that. Sorry, my spelling is not very well. My spelling's fine. It's more my handwriting. Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, okay, which was a significant step in bringing the arms race to an end. What does it do? Well, it ends all use of intermediate range ballistic and cruise missiles. They are missiles that can go from 500 to 5,500 kilometers, okay? So an important moment, still largely symbolic because the main type of ultimate kind of like cruise missile is of course ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that do still exist, and SLBMs, which of course are submarine launched ballistic missiles, okay? They still exist, but it is an important moment and I shouldn't downplay it, because for the first time what you get is you get both sides within the arms race, okay, within the Cold War, actually saying that they are going to destroy a whole class of nuclear weapons. Which is really important. And crucially, Gorbachev didn't demand the treaty be conditional on SDI and didn't insist that the British or French nuclear weapons should be included too. Gorbachev also, crucially, agrees to withdraw from Afghanistan after the summit. And I think this is so significant and symbolic for several reasons. It's partly the agreement itself, but also the precedent it sets. Cooperation was now genuinely possible, okay? Cooperation was possible and could happen, okay? And here's some other, I forgot I had this down at the bottom, whoops. Here are some other statements that link to the wider impact. It's the first time both sides agreed to remove a whole class of nuclear weapons. The USSR made no demands the treaty was conditional on SDI, and as I already told you, the USSR did not make Britain or France and their weapons as part of the deal. So our final summit involving Ronald Reagan, and you can of course see Ronald Reagan there looking, well, what should we say? We say imperious, definitely a strong media performer, of course, Ronald Reagan, and you can see him there in front of the Kremlin too, having a nice little tour by Gorbachev. And of course you can see Nancy Reagan here too, who was of course Ronald Reagan's wife. They got married in 1952 and she was the first lady of the United States, of course, from the same time Reagan was president, 1981 to 1989. A really interesting first lady, shall we say. So let's have a look now at Moscow. So the aim for Reagan was to agree to the START talks, okay, so Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. But this was something really START that had been discussed for about 15 years at this point, really since the mid-70s, and they weren't ready to sign it, okay. Instead, there was a focus on cultural exchanges and human rights, okay, and in total there were 7 different agreements: fishing rights, student exchange programs, okay. So just some light, gentle stuff on human rights and some cultural projects. Not quite the big breakthrough that people wanted in actually reducing nuclear weapons. That, of course, would have to wait until 1991, where Bush and Gorbachev sign the START Treaty. Now, this was an important moment symbolically. Ronald Reagan, one of the most iconic US presidents at this point, he'd been president for about, 7.5 years, okay, a really significant period of time. He's coming towards the end of his term. He goes to Moscow, he touches down in Moscow, and when he's addressed by the Soviet people directly, and they're asked they ask him whether he believes that the USSR was still an evil empire, he says, "No, that was another time, another era." I think that actually wasn't a bad Reagan impression, to be fair. And therefore, what we can say is that summit diplomacy, particularly when we think about Moscow, was symbolic rather than substantive. But the symbolism did matter. It showed how far relations had changed. And I love this impact statement that I've put on your flashcards, which is, in many ways, the content wasn't important. Reagan's presence was. It was illustrative of greater cooperation and a symbol of the withdrawing conflict between the superpowers, paving the way for the end of the Cold War. So those are our different summits, our first 4 key summits. And in the lesson, we thought about which one was the most significant, and most of us said Washington. A few people say Geneva, the odd person said Moscow, but I would say about 80% of the class always end up going for Washington. Why? Well, of course, because of that, the INF Treaty, important moment in ending the Cold War. I better get all this text off the slide, hadn't I? Whoopsie daisy. Here we go. So why was summit diplomacy important? Well, it was important for several reasons. It helped facilitate the end of the arms race, because this is proving that not only are sides willing to limit weapons like they did previously with the SALT treaties of the 1970s, but actually they were willing to begin to end the arms race by removing and then eventually reducing weapons. Okay, so really important. And a reminder in that arms race lesson where we spoke about the different stages of the arms race, we obviously have the US nuclear monopoly in the 40s, before the Soviets get nuclear weapons in 1949. What did we then say? Well, we then spoke afterwards about the importance of testing in the 1950s and banning testing after the Soviets get nuclear weapons, and there's that initial arms race. We get this drive towards banning testing. And then we get into the idea of horizontal proliferation, limiting other countries from getting nuclear weapons. Then we get to limiting vertical proliferation, and then we get to reducing vertical proliferation, which is exactly what we see here. It also accelerates new thinking. It has a direct impact on Gorbachev and new thinking, and leads to Reagan and Thatcher embracing Gorbachev's much more diplomatic approach. And it also leads to the end of the war in Afghanistan. When we think about that, when basically Gorbachev begins to remove troops in 1987 into 1988, and troops are removed from Afghanistan. Brilliant. So a couple of final bits for this part of the spec that we need to know, which is of course SDI. Now SDI is of course Reagan's Star Wars project. It stands for the Strategic Defense Initiative, and it is a defense system against ICBMs that was designed to be placed in space, that would have essentially a quite sophisticated laser that could shoot down any cruise missile that was loaded with a nuclear weapon, and it could shoot it down as it traveled around the globe. Very sophisticated system. And it basically aimed to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, and therefore basically give the Americans a defensive monopoly and therefore complete nuclear superiority in the arms race. Because if you have the ultimate ABM, anti-ballistic missile system, which Star Wars would be, then you have complete superiority in the arms race, because all Soviet weapons are obsolete, and that would be damaging for the Soviets for obvious reasons, because they would be more prone to an attack themselves, because the doctrine of MAD basically becomes redundant because there is no mutually assured destruction, and MAD is essentially the doctrine that has been holding things in place for the last 25 years. So the crucial point is it's never actually developed. So you'll often hear people, and I remember being at a wedding once, and this guy came up to me and found out I was a history teacher, and he was like, "Oh, what ended the Cold War?" He'd had a few lemonades, I must add. And he asked me, what ended the Cold War? And I said, well, ultimately it was the economic factors of da-da-da-da-da. And he went, no, mate, it was the Star Wars. It was Reagan's laser. And then I had to educate him on the fact that the Soviets actually, the Americans never actually developed it. They never possessed it. It was classic Reagan posturing and classic Reagan rhetoric. But it did force the USSR to keep high military spending and to stay competitive. And this is what you quite often see from Republican presidents. They like to look really tough on the world stage, and they want to be seen as a really strong commander-in-chief, and they will basically posture that they have, the most sophisticated weapons, the greatest army, the biggest army. And in fairness, they do have the biggest army, but they'll often go over the top as what? Deterrence, okay? Basically as deterrence, okay, against others, and as a way to get what you want when it comes to negotiations. Now we need to know about Bush. So Bush is of course president who replaces Reagan by 1989. He does actually stand in for Reagan a bit in 88 when Reagan gets very ill as his vice president, but he wins the 1988 presidential election and becomes president in 1989 through to 1993. And crucially, Bush's relationship with Gorbachev and the Soviets is just basically let things take its course, be very cautious. He didn't want to undermine Gorbachev. He didn't want to speak out against him in public. He didn't want to even consider or contemplate sending troops to Eastern Europe. or aggravating the situation. He just wanted to allow events to unfold because he needed Gorbachev to stay in power, because Gorbachev was a man who was willing to work with the Americans to end the Cold War. And just a reminder that it's Bush who eventually signed to START talks in 1991, or the START Treaty, which basically reduces nuclear weapon stockpiles by about 25%. Significant moment in the end of the Cold War. So, a bit of a summary. Those are our summits, nice and easy. And here's a little summary you can read through from this part of the spec. Summit diplomacy marked a turning point in the Cold War because it began to facilitate the ends of the arms race. It reduced the risk of nuclear conflict. It reflects ideological softening and pragmatic cooperation on both sides between East and West. It also highlights the importance of leadership and personal diplomacy from both Reagan and Gorbachev. And it's a key cause of the end of the Cold War. It's not the sole cause. For me, it's not the most important cause, but it is definitely something that can be a paragraph, and it's actually quite an easy paragraph to write, guys. Basically, think about blending and manipulating our full summits together, picking out a few key bits, probably the INF Treaty, and then towards the end of your paragraph, bang in one or two of these sentences here, and you are absolutely flying. I think that's the easiest revision video I've done so far, hence why I did it as the third video. I hope you like my new microphone, and I hope you enjoyed this session looking at summit diplomacy. Have a great rest of the day, and yeah, keep revising hard, guys. Bye-bye.